Why do so many Americans believe they have a Cherokee ancestor when the numbers say that story is almost mathematically impossible? Before we get into it, if this kind of deep dive into hidden history speaks to you, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And if you know someone with a family legend about a Cherokee princess, send them this video. They need to see what the science actually says. Here's the number that starts everything. Somewhere around 70 million Americans, close to a quarter of the entire country, believe they have Native American blood in their family tree. And it is not vague. It is not some tribe somewhere back there. It is almost always the same tribe, Cherokee. Now I'll hold that number next to another one. Today, the Cherokee Nation has about 400,000 enrolled citizens. Go back further, before Europeans ever set foot in North America. And historians estimate the entire Cherokee population sat somewhere between 25,000 and 60,000 people total across their whole territory. Even if you stretch the math as far as it can possibly go, even if every single Cherokee person alive 300 years ago somehow survived every war, every disease, every forced removal, and had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who all lived to pass the bloodline forward, you still cannot get from 60,000 people to 70 million descendants. The numbers simply do not work. Something does not add up. And once you notice that, you cannot unsee it. So what is actually going on? Why does this one story, out of every possible ancestry claim in America, show up again and again, in family after family, generation after generation? To understand that, we have to go back to where the story started. The Cherokee were not just another tribe in the historical memory of early Americans. They were, in the language of the time, one of the so-called civilized tribes, a term we do not use anymore because of exactly what it implies, but it explains why they were so visible. In the early 1800s, a Cherokee man named Sequoyah did something almost no one in recorded history has ever done alone. He invented an entire writing system from scratch, a syllabary that let the Cherokee language be written down for the first time. Within years, the Cherokee Nation had its own newspaper printed in that new script. They had a written constitution. They had a functioning government modeled with real structure and real law. To settlers spreading across the growing United States, the Cherokee were not a distant, mysterious people. They were present. They were in the newspapers. They were in political debates. In 1838 and 1839, the United States government forced the Cherokee people from their homes in Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama, and marched them hundreds of miles west into what is now Oklahoma. Thousands died along the way, from exposure, from starvation, from exhaustion. History remembers this as the Trail of Tears. The tragedy was so enormous, so widely reported, that it became mythologized. And in that mythology, something subtle happened. The Cherokee were slowly reshaped in the public mind into a symbol, a noble, tragic, vanishing people, swallowed by history. Except they never actually vanished. The myth said they did. And when a culture believes a people are gone, disappeared into the past, something strange happens. People start to feel free to claim a piece of them. This is where the family legend begins to take shape. And here's the strange part. Ask people across completely different regions of the country to describe their Cherokee ancestor, and the story comes back almost identical every single time. The ancestor is nearly always a woman. She is nearly always called a princess, despite the fact that Cherokee society had no royal bloodline structure like that at all. She is almost always described as having high cheekbones. And she is always placed far enough back in the family tree, a great-grandmother, a great-great-grandmother, that nobody alive actually remembers her. Far enough that no one can check the story, but close enough that it still feels personal. Researchers noticed this pattern decades ago and gave it a name, the Cherokee Princess myth. It shows up in white families and in black families. It shows up across the South, across Appalachia, across the Midwest. It is so consistent, so uniform in its details, that some historians believe it functions less like a memory and more like a template, a story Americans reach for when they want to explain something about themselves that they cannot otherwise put into words. For generations, that story lived only in living rooms and family reunions, impossible to prove or disprove. Then something changed everything. Around the year 2000, direct-to-consumer DNA testing became available for the first time. It started out slow and expensive, but by the mid-2000s, companies had made genetic testing affordable, fast, and available to anyone willing to spit into a tube and mail it away. By the 2010s, tens of millions of Americans had done exactly that. Because grandmother had said Cherokee, because the legend had been passed down as fact, and now, finally, there was a way to confirm it. The results were not what almost anyone expected. Across study after study, involving hundreds of thousands of test results, researchers found something remarkable. Among people who believed they had Native American ancestry, and specifically Cherokee ancestry, The percentage who actually carried detectable Indigenous American genetic markers was startlingly small. One analysis found that fewer than 5% of Americans who believed in native ancestry showed any statistically meaningful trace of it in their DNA at all. The Cherokee Princess was not showing up in the science. And this is where the easy explanation, the comfortable one, starts to fall apart. If this were simply a case of families misremembering details, you would expect the mistakes to scatter randomly. Someone would think their German great-grandfather was actually Polish. Someone would confuse an Irish ancestor with a Scottish one. Random confusion produces random errors. But this is not random. Millions of families across different states, different races, different economic backgrounds, all converging on the exact same story. Same tribe, same gender, same royal title that never historically existed. That is not what a memory error looks like. That is what a pattern looks like. And patterns have causes. 3 explanations have emerged from researchers trying to understand this, and each one reveals something different about American history. The first is the most uncomfortable, and it is called genealogical laundering. Some historians argue that in parts of the American South, the Cherokee Princess story became a socially acceptable way for families to explain physical features, like dark hair or darker skin, without admitting the real explanation, which was African ancestry. In a society built around strict racial categorization, where being classified as anything other than white carried enormous legal and social consequences, claiming a Cherokee ancestor was a far safer story to tell than the truth. Cherokee ancestry carried a kind of tragic romance in the American imagination. Genetic researchers have found real cases where families carrying the Cherokee Princess legend show, on actual testing, significant West African genetic markers, and absolutely no East Asian or Siberian markers, the kind of markers associated with Indigenous American ancestry. These are populations that genetically diverged tens of thousands of years ago. They are distinct enough that scientists can identify them with very high confidence. The story, in these families, was not really about a Cherokee ancestor at all. It was a shield. The second theory is gentler, and it is called geographic memory. It suggests that some of these stories reflect something real, an actual relationship, an actual person, but that the specific tribal identity got lost somewhere along the way. In the 18th and 19th century Southeast, dozens of different indigenous nations lived and intermarried with settlers. Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, Catawba, Powhatan, Lumbee, and many smaller communities most people today have never even heard of. When families with mixed heritage passed their story down through only 1 or 2 generations, the specific nation often got forgotten. And Cherokee, being by far the most famous name, the one everyone had heard of, quietly filled in the blank. The ancestor may have been real. The tribal name attached to them may not have been. The third theory is the newest and, honestly, the strangest. It comes from population genetics, and it reaches back much further than anyone expected. If this video is giving you a completely different way of thinking about a story you always assumed was simple, that reaction, that feeling of your assumptions shifting, is exactly why this channel exists. Tap subscribe so you never miss the next one, and drop a comment telling me if your family had a version of this legend too. In 2012, researchers publishing in the American Journal of Human Genetics identified something they started calling the ghost population problem. Here's what that means. When scientists build ancestry models, they compare a living person's DNA against reference populations, groups whose genetic history is considered well-documented and stable. But again and again, the models kept detecting genetic signals that did not match any known reference group cleanly. Ancient DNA recovered from burial sites across North America showed genetic profiles that simply do not appear in living populations the way the standard models predicted they should. What this suggests, carefully and cautiously, is that some of the ancestry Americans are attributing to Cherokee or Native American heritage might actually be something older. Traces of ancient populations that contributed, through complicated and still not fully mapped pathways, to both Indigenous Americans and some European populations, long before the ethnic groups we recognize today ever existed as distinct categories. This is not fringe speculation. It is active, ongoing research. A 2020 study published in the journal Cell used ancient DNA pulled from burial sites across North and South America to demonstrate that the genetic history of the Americas is far more complicated than one single founding migration from Northeast Asia thousands of years ago. There were multiple waves. There was mixing and exchange across regions we are only now beginning to properly map. Some of that deep, ancient ancestry may exist today in places, and in people, that the simple binary of native versus European was never designed to explain. In other words, the Cherokee Princess story might actually be reaching for something true, just something far older, far stranger, and far more complicated than a specific great-great-grandmother with a specific name and a specific tribe. But here comes the twist that almost nobody wants to sit with. Because when researchers actually went to the Cherokee Nation itself and asked how they think about all of this, the millions of ancestry claims, the DNA tests, the family legends, the answer they got back had almost nothing to do with genetics at all. The Cherokee Nation does not determine citizenship through DNA or blood percentage. It never has. Citizenship is based on documented lineal descent from individuals listed on the Dawes Rolls, a federal census of Cherokee citizens taken between 1898 and 1914. That is the standard. Not a saliva sample, not a percentage on a screen, a documented, traceable connection to real, named, recorded people. Chuck Hoskin Jr., the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, has said this publicly, clearly, and consistently for years. Being Cherokee is not a percentage of DNA. It is community. It is language. It is shared history and shared law. It is the living relationship between a people and their nation. A positive DNA result does not make someone Cherokee, and the absence of one does not automatically make someone's family story false either. Both of those things can be true at the same time, and that is exactly the part most people never stop to consider. What this reveals is something bigger than one myth about one tribe. It reveals that the entire framework millions of Americans have been using, the idea that a DNA test can confirm or deny whether someone belongs to a tribal nation, was the wrong framework from the very beginning. Tribal nations are political entities. They are sovereign governments with the right to define their own membership the same way any nation defines its own citizenship. They are not genetic categories waiting to be unlocked by a laboratory. The fact that so much of mainstream America reached instinctively for a DNA test to settle this question says far more about how mainstream America thinks about Indigenous identity than it says about genetics itself. So where does that leave the family story? Not as a simple lie, and not as a confirmed truth either. It leaves it somewhere far more human than that. The genetic history of the Americas is still actively being rewritten. Every few years, new ancient DNA samples reshape the migration models scientists thought were settled. The founding populations of this continent were never one single group moving in one single wave. They were multiple populations, mixing in different ways, at different places, at different times, some persisting for thousands of years, some leaving only faint traces that modern consumer tests are not even built to detect. At the same time, the documentary record tells a very different, very real story. The Dawes Rolls, the census documents, the land allotment records, these describe actual Cherokee people, whose descendants can be traced, whose history is documented in real archives, and whose citizenship today is defined not by a corporate algorithm or a spit tube, but by the sovereign decisions of their own nation. Between those two realities, the ancient, tangled genetics on one side and the documented political history on the other, sits the family legend, neither fully confirming it nor fully destroying it, just floating there, doing something else entirely. Because here is the truth underneath all of this. The Cherokee Princess story is rarely a deliberate lie. It is something more interesting than that. It is a story that millions of families have reached for because they were searching for something they could not otherwise name, a way to feel rooted in a land they sensed some deeper connection to but could not quite prove, a way of saying, we belong here, we have always belonged here, this land is somehow in us, it is longing, dressed up as memory, a reach for depth in a culture that often feels disconnected from anything older than a few generations back. That longing is real. It is deeply human, but it is not the same thing as history, and it is definitely not the same thing as identity. Because while millions of Americans were spitting into tubes trying to confirm a great-great-grandmother who may never have existed, the actual Cherokee people were never gone in the first place. They were never destroyed by the Trail of Tears, no matter how the myth wanted to frame them as a vanishing, tragic footnote. They were never quietly absorbed and genetically diluted into someone else's family folklore. The Cherokee Nation is a living, functioning, self-governing nation today. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians still holds their ancestral homeland in North Carolina. The United Keetoowah Band of Cherokee Indians continues ceremonies and traditions passed down for centuries. Hundreds of thousands of enrolled Cherokee citizens are alive right now, living full, modern, complicated lives, and many of them have watched their identity get casually claimed by strangers who wanted the romance of the story without ever learning the actual history behind it. The rise of consumer DNA testing did not fix this problem. In many ways, it made it worse. It reinforced the idea that Indigenous identity is just a number in a database, a percentage you either own or you don't, something you can purchase access to for $99 in a mailed envelope. But real identity was never something a lab could hand you. It was never meant to be. What the actual peer-reviewed science shows, once you go past the surface-level consumer product and into the real research, is that human ancestry is ancient, tangled, and resistant to simple confirmation. All of us descend from populations that moved, mixed, separated, and reunited in patterns scientists are still working to fully map. patterns far too complicated to fit inside a neat little pie chart on a phone screen. The Cherokee Princess may not be sitting inside anyone's DNA results, but the feeling that created her, the deep human need to belong to something older than a family photo album, to find a thread connecting you to this specific land, that feeling is real. That impulse is not shameful. It is deeply, universally human. But the real question was never whether the story is true. The real question is what it would actually mean to honor the people whose real, documented, painful, living history keeps quietly getting rewritten into someone else's inherited legend. That is not a question a DNA test can ever answer. It never could. And maybe understanding that, finally, is the one piece of this story that actually matters. If this changed how you think about a story you have probably heard your whole life, that is exactly the kind of shift this channel is built for. Hit like, subscribe for the next one, and share this with the one person in your family who still swears they are part Cherokee Princess. Let them see what the truth actually looks like.